If we're aiming for success in anything, it helps to have the equipment that we need organized before we start. So I have my reference. I have my paper here that I'm going to draw on. I have pencils to draw with. Now I've decided to draw this with a 2B pencil, so I've got 3 sharpened 2B pencils, and that means that if I drop one and the tip breaks off, or if I press too heavily and the tip breaks off, or if one blunts a bit too quickly because of the way I'm using it, I can quickly switch to another one without losing the rhythm of my drawing. However, I've got 2 more pencils that are darker grades than the 2Bs that I'll be doing my main line work in. One's a 3B and one's a 5B. Sometimes, rather than pressing more heavily with a lighter grade, we're better off going to a darker grade pencil. I've also got my eraser, but I'm hoping not to use that at all if possible. And I have a blade to sharpen my pencils, because a blade gives a much longer piece of graphite to draw with than the stumpy little cones we end up with from these little school days sharpeners. And while I draw this, I'll explain my tips for finishing with a successful pencil drawing. Let's start. This drawing of the National Gallery in London took me 40 minutes in real time to draw. And I use the sort of style and technique I'd be using if I was sitting in front of it rather than looking at a photo of it. My first tip with this drawing is to establish a rhythm in our line work, in our progress, in our process. A rhythm which is slower at first and then builds. At the very start, we want to get accurate proportions for the parts that we draw, because as we expand out from those, we're going to use them to reference, to align new parts that we draw. And therefore, we really want to keep them as accurate as possible. So we invest more time at the start to create greater accuracy. And this will reflect somewhat in our line work, and our lines will therefore be a little more considered, perhaps a little straighter. Perhaps our corners will join up a little more precisely. But as the drawing progresses, we'll become more comfortable with the actual drawing process, we'll become more comfortable with the subject because we'll be looking at it continuously, and we'll become more confident with placing our pencil accurately on the paper, because we'll have more places we can compare where it aligns with as the drawing progresses. And so we'll often draw with a faster rhythm as we move into the second half. And because this is often in the more peripheral parts, we end up getting a more gestural feel in probably what are the less immediately important parts of the scene when we look at it, which can create a lovely variety, a lovely movement of line work. It can introduce a nice sort of sense of movement that can be hard to get if we draw it all very precisely the same way the whole way through. So that's my first tip, is to establish a rhythm of a slow beginning, careful, precise, getting proportions correct, and then picking up the pace as we gain confidence and progress the drawing. My second tip is, before we start to draw, is to consider the size of the drawing carefully. Notice I just sharpened the edge on a bit of paper. It's always handy to have a bit of paper where we can just put the point back on if we've lost it and if we need it. Consider the size of the drawing carefully, because the size of the paper will determine the size of our drawing, and that will determine the scale of our drawing, which will determine how much detail we're able to draw. If we do a very small drawing, then it's going to be hard to put too much detail on, which can work really well, or it may end up being a problem, because if we're trying to squeeze too much detail in, just with the natural blunting of a pencil, it may mean that our lines end up getting too close together, and we literally don't have space between the lines to draw the detail that we're wanting to draw. Or if we go too large, then to draw a larger drawing often demands more technical skills, being able to draw long lines freehand that stay roughly straight. is a bigger challenge if our paper size is large. So different sizes suit different techniques, different drawing styles, and it's very helpful, I think, if we work out our size, and particularly at the start, we stay, relatively speaking, at the same size. That will give us one less set of factors that we have to juggle as we hone our skills and hone our observation and hone our strategizing of how we're going to draw. Because developing a strategy for our drawing that we consistently bring to drawings can be important. Now, although I talked about using a darker tone, a darker grade of pencil in the introduction, as it turned out, I only used the 2B pencil in this. I found that I was happy with keeping it a bit sharper than I expected to, and then pressing a bit heavier, I thought gave me the sort of feel I was wanting. I was wanting my shaded and shadowed areas to still show evidence of line work rather than to be just a graphite tone. I didn't want to blur the space between the lines. I wanted to keep this still a drawing that had a very linear feel to it, even in the shadows, even in the values. And have a look at how I've drawn the more detailed parts, because I haven't actually drawn the detail. I've suggested the detail in my line work, and this is a really helpful technique to develop. Look at those Corinthian capitals. I've really just added a little bit of value to indicate shadows. I haven't got bogged down in trying to draw the little acanthus leaves that ring around the columns. So just going for the effect in our line work is really important. And if you want to watch my actual drawing more slowly, you can use that cog symbol that you'll see on the screen to slow it down to half speed. That will make it considerably slower, and you shouldn't have any problem listening to the commentary if you want as well at that speed. My third point, and this is really important when we draw with pencil, is don't worry about mistakes. Don't fixate on mistakes. I said at the start, I hope not to use my eraser. I certainly don't plan to, and I know now that I didn't, in fact, have to use it, because what I've learned is that most lines in the wrong place can either be hidden or they won't be noticed by the end when all of the correct lines are in the right place. A mistake never looks as bad as it looks as when you've just made it. And particularly early on, when there's a lot of blank paper all around it, a lot of white, that just seems to highlight the mistake. When all the lines are in place, it'll work much more easily. It will work in. But the important thing, I think, is to put the correct line in place. When I did those columns at the very start, a couple of them had lines that weren't in the right place. When I did the pilasters on the right-hand side, I didn't leave nearly enough space for the window, and I just moved the pilaster along to the right a bit further. And the window now covers that wrong line. So we shouldn't worry about it. When we start to erase lines, we break our drawing rhythm and we start to focus on errors rather than on drawing. We get more hung up with wrong lines than being able to concentrate on drawing correct lines. It can become a real problem, and if we're a bit perfectionistic, it can really end up taking the joy out of drawing, because we end up erasing so many lines, we just make a mess. So try not to use the eraser at all. Don't even put it on the paper, perhaps. My fourth point is to consider depth and overlap when we draw. If you look at this lamppost that I'm just drawing around right now, you can see that I drew the lamppost first so that I can bring lines up close to it, but not actually through it. If it's at all possible, I think it usually works best to avoid drawing directly over something behind. Draw the first things, the closest things first, and then stop the lines before they go behind. It can require a bit of planning, but I think it's a very, very helpful technique to get into. But also consider depth. What are the closest things and what are the furthest things? And we want to create the effect of depth. And having a lighter touch with less detail further back and a bit of a heavier line with perhaps more detail closer can create a sense of distance. My fifth point is that little bit of paper that you see up in the top right corner is to keep our point sharp. Depending on how soft our grade of pencil is, it can wear down really quickly. And so as soon as we notice that it's not quite as sharp as what we want, we need to put that shape back on, particularly if, as I'm doing here where I'm drawing the people, I need a really sharp point to my pencil, because if the point doubles in size, then their heads will double in width, and then they'll certainly be out of proportion. So learning to keep our pencil sharp, or at least sharp enough, is a really important skill to do, because if we don't, it'll end up like almost we've changed pencil halfway through. So again, these figures that I'm adding in the front are very gestural, but they're important for giving a sense of scale, for a sense of distance, because there is quite some distance across Trafalgar Square from the fountain where I'm standing to the actual National Gallery. And it's the people and the way their size changes from the closest ones to the furthest ones that gives me the strongest indication of how far this distance is. So I actually found keeping the scale of these people in the correct proportion relative to each other the most difficult part of this whole drawing. But as I sort of finish these last details, I can at least start to relax a little. And so in my mind, this is a relatively loose freehand drawing that is a suitable sort of style for relatively quick sketching on location. G'day, I'm Stephen Travers. I hope you found these 5 points interesting. I hope helpful. I hope some of them even applicable, that you can incorporate them into your drawing. I'll post this reference photo on my channel community page so that if you'd like to have a go drawing it yourself, you'll find it there and you can print off a copy. But hey, whatever you're drawing and however you're drawing it, make sure you have fun. And if at all possible, with your pencil drawing, have fun without using the eraser. It really is a great sense of freedom.